Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here so early at the start of the day. I'm Elizabeth Campbell, the Executive Director of ODI Global Washington. Thank you so much to our panelists who have agreed to join us today. I want to begin by just offering a few framing remarks, and then I really want to jump into the questions and the discussion. We'll have some time toward the end of our morning to engage with you as well as to those who've joined us online. So this panel is about the future of humanitarianism, and this conversation is taking place amidst some of the most dramatic changes to the global humanitarian community in the last 25 years. Many of these issues, of course, all of you are tracking, but we are facing a massive reduction in humanitarian financing. If you look at the last 10 years alone, the United States was carrying roughly 30 to 40% of the total global humanitarian spend, anywhere between 8 to 14 billion, the overwhelming majority of which went to the United Nations. Second, for humanitarian actors around the world, but importantly, the civilians, they are there to partner and support, are experiencing a massive lack of respect for or adherence to international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles enshrined in a variety of UN General Assembly resolutions. Overnight, in the last 3 months or so, there has also been an extraordinary loss of capacity, including entire organizations disappearing, particularly at the local, community, national level, coordination mechanisms, technical skills, information management, and early warning systems. And fourth, I would say very quickly, there's been an acceleration to the damage to the basic value system that underpins a lot of this work over the last several decades, protecting and assisting civilians in conflict, those displaced, and communities impacted by natural disasters. At the same time, these seismic and even sudden changes do create some opportunities for change, for changing aid flows, for addressing longstanding protracted situations, for developing new partnerships, and relying on different types of expertise to address new and old crises. So we have a wide range of expertise here today. Let's begin. I'd like to start with Kate Phillips Barrasso, Vice President, Global Policy and Advocacy at Mercy Corps. As mentioned, the U.S. has historically been the largest donor with global presence. They are actively abdicating themselves from this role by significantly reducing their financial and human capacity. What does this mean from your perspective in terms of the global humanitarian system? Does it create any new opportunities? Kate.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everybody for joining today. Opportunity is not a word I actually hear associated very frequently with what we've experienced over the last 3 months. I mean, as you noted and opened up, but I just want to dwell on it a bit, is just the magnitude of the U.S. presence in the global humanitarian space. Sometimes those numbers are higher when we're talking about individual responses in places like Somalia, for example, other places in the Horn of Africa. And it's just, we often are asked the question, can someone step in and replace this? Are you actively fundraising to try to make up this dearth of funding? And the truth of the matter is $40 billion, which is what USAID's humanitarian and development budget is just not going to appear from other donors. In fact, we are actively seeing cuts. It's probably not lost on several of the people in this room that European donors are also cutting, namely the UK and the Netherlands, and foundations and private individuals are just not set up to be able to provide this type of resourcing, and certainly not with very little warning and opportunity to plan for it. So it's not just about the individual responses as well. I want to really stress something Elizabeth mentioned about data and systems. The US really funded a number of different operations. I think we've all heard of FuseNet, particularly important in terms of famine monitoring, food insecurity monitoring, all of these different types of things that humanitarian actors use to sort of gear their responses, make sure they're efficient and effective, prevent overlap. A lot of that is now not funded or is desperately trying to make up for that funding. And it will affect the humanitarian system writ large, in addition to the impact of the US pulling out at a time which, I failed to mention is probably the worst possible time to be moving away from global humanitarian response. The only opportunity I really see here, though, is, when you're losing funding this in such dramatic fashion, in such rapid fashion, it is a clarifying moment, right? And I think there are a number of different reforms of the global humanitarian system that have been bandied about, talked about for a long time. Of course, we'll all think about the Grand Bargain that was adopted at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, but also more recent ones that the Emergency Relief Coordinator proposed to the ISC on this humanitarian reset, which outline a number of very practical steps that can be taken, not to, replace the delta here that will be made up by some of these things, will not replace the disappearing humanitarian funding, but it does provide an impetus the way there has never been before to do things that are much more efficient. And I would just note those things are, for example, hopefully defaulting to cash as a modality as one of the most efficient ways to serve populations where that's possible, which is in most places during emergencies, simplifying donor reporting requirements, simplifying and streamlining the cluster system, pooling back-end services at some of the UN agencies, and dramatically simplifying humanitarian response plans. And finally, I think pooling, using whatever pooled resources we have in country-based pooled funds to support the local and national actors, which I hope we talk about later, have been hit hardest by some of these precipitous aid terminations, particularly on the part of the United States. So I'll just close there saying, these are not new ideas. The roadmaps are out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I just think that the urgency and the exigency is now there to make these reforms a reality, to try to make up, even in part, what has been lost with all of these aid cuts.
Thank you. Jim Richardson, former head of foreign assistance at the Department of State and USAID under the first Trump administration, current chairman of the board at the Pompeo Foundation. As Kate was, describing, proponents of U.S. foreign assistance have long spoken about reform, both across Republican and Democratic administrations. There have been examples of incremental reforms throughout. We are now living through some of the most radical changes in our lived experience. You were a proponent of the state aid merger. What has been gained? What has been lost?
Just to clarify, I was not in favor of the merger.
I apologize.
Yeah, no, I wrote an op-ed, I don't know, two weeks ago that said, when I was head of transformation at USAID during the first Trump administration, we had explored merger, and there was a big push to merge state and USAID at that time. And the decision was we aren't going to really save any money, and that the core competency of each organization is different, and that by merger you're going to muddle the technical capacity of both. And we've really kind of seen this, right? I mean, that one, merger of your development agency and your foreign ministry is not unusual. In fact, most developed countries have gone that route. So it is a logical choice to make. But there are pitfalls when you do that. And we have seen that loss of technical capacity, mostly on the development side, through such a merger. And so my op-ed really said, if you go down this path, which it seems like the Trump administration would like to do that, and has put out a proposal to do that, then you want to make sure that you are looking at that technical capacity of development professionals and how do you maintain that capacity in sort of a larger ecosystem. I think that question is still yet to be determined, and so we'll see what that really looks like. One part that I have strongly advocated for over the past 10 years or so is the merger of PRM and BHA, which will happen under this proposal. I'm glad that the Trump administration is going to continue humanitarian assistance work. That's great. And really looking to merge the capacity of both of those organizations, I think will be a net positive to the development or to the humanitarian sector writ large, but also really to the coherence of the U.S. government response. As we know, internally displaced versus externally displaced peoples is often a function of an imaginary political line, and not necessarily a function of the need of those humans. And so for us to take the approach of a human-based versus a political line-based approach to humanitarian assistance, I think is a good thing. And I think if done correctly, and that's really the next part of what I think will be a much longer process than the Trump administration is believing. But if done correctly, I think could be a real positive to the development response for the United States. We'll see what comes next. Obviously, Secretary Rubio put out his proposal, I think yesterday. People are still digesting it. It is certainly a lot better than the Easter proposal that was clearly put out by others. But we'll see what the Hill response is. We'll see what continued refinement is going to happen. I think merging F with J probably does make sense. So there's some parts of the proposal that I agree with. Some parts I think can be improved. But I hope that Secretary Rubio will work with Congress to really come up with a great proposal to do this and do this well and do this thoughtfully and do it in a way that maintains the technical capacity of our humanitarian and development professionals.
Thank you. Minister Florestal, Haiti has received significant international aid, estimated at over $13 billion for relief and recovery in the last 10 to 12 years. As the Minister of Planning and External Cooperation, tell us about your experience in receiving and managing this assistance.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll start by putting in doubt that we received 12 billion. It must be 12 that were committed, not necessarily delivered. And a lot of it, if it was delivered, it wasn't delivered to the population. That's after the earthquake. I imagine that's where the numbers got up recently, and for the past decade, numbers have been going down by a lot. And right now that we are in a humanitarian crisis, security crisis, political crisis, what we are receiving is very little compared to the needs. There was a impact assessment done with the lead of the government, with the support of the World Bank, the UN, and the IDB. And it's only for the region of Port-au-Prince. It was estimated at over $1 billion. And Artibonite, which were at the time last year, the places that had the most violence and most insecurity. And we learned yesterday, we had a donor roundtable that they had put it at 1.3. We had estimated 3 billion. Now they're talking about 600 million. What is our experience? It's a mixed experience. It's after shocks, after the earthquake, and recently with the humanitarian crisis, food security crisis for the past, I would say, 2 years. It's a damning experience. We see new challenges. The first in line to quote what is needed usually is the UN. The numbers that we get in respect to what is estimated is really dire, less than 30%. And needs have been increasing as the situation has worsened over the year. We had displaced from 30 to 60,000 and 100,000, and with the repatriation, both from the Dominican Republic and from the US, mostly from the Dominican Republic now, but we can estimate we have about $1 million people displaced. Those are the last estimates. Most people would estimate somewhere for 600 million. And I, even as a minister yesterday, wasn't aware that they went to 1 million now. And the displaced are not just in Port-au-Prince, mostly in the Port-au-Prince area. But as you know, if they are repatriating people all over the border from the DR in the middle of the night, anywhere in the border, and these people come with nothing, they go into extreme poverty. Whatever they were able to make outside, they're not allowed to take it. So, so the government has to compensate as much as it can. And you can imagine in an economy that's been contracting for 6 years, it's with the borders not being well secured. There's a lot of contraband. There's a lot of things going on, so that fiscal receipts, despite all the efforts, are not going to be sufficient. So humanitarian aid, today, I would say we had many conversations on it. I think some international partners are making a line between humanitarian and development. And I think it's a very bad approach, because we're not going to get to the development in the medium and long term if we don't take care of the short term. People will not be there. And not only that, there are ways to make humanitarian approaches more structural, and this is what we've been promoting. And some of it is being done, like when you are doing feeding programs, buy local. When anytime you, and by where, not just local in the country, but local where you are actually intervening. There are a lot of corrections to be made in terms of coordination, and approaches differ per donor and from NGOs. And the other topic, I think, which is challenging, NGOs bring a lot of support, but in a disorderly manner a lot of times. And there's a lack of efficiency because there isn't that coordination. There isn't enough coordination among donors. There isn't enough coordination for NGOs. My ministry, the Minister of Planning, is also responsible to recognize NGO, give them time, agree to their program, and give them the authorization when they request to import things tax-free for humanitarian and other needs. And unfortunately, we don't have the capacity right now, particularly outside, even in Port-au-Prince, because security, outside Port-au-Prince, because our regional offices have been neglected, and we are just right now trying to strengthen them with, I don't know, cars, motorcycles, electricity, etc. And so they don't have the capacity to really follow what the NGOs, which is our responsibility, are doing. Is it really what they're saying they're doing? Is it conform to what they declared at the beginning and what they are declaring at the end? And more importantly, what we are set to do, what we're working on right now, the ministry, is try to revive the platform so that everybody knows which ones are recognized, and also make an effort to dialogue with the NGOs to make sure that they align themselves with the priorities. And not only that, what's dangerous in it is if we don't take that into hand, you have NGOs who ask for a permit authorization to function in a sector, let's say education, and then along the way, somehow they find financing for health. They change without telling us and without the Ministry of Health knowing what they are doing and whether they are in line with what the Ministry of Health has decided for their policy is in regards to whatever issue that has to do with health. So it's a mixture. A lot of the humanitarian assistance we got in the health sector, whether it's Médecins Sans Frontières and others, and USAID, a lot of presence have gone in Port-au-Prince because of insecurity, but we got a lot of letters from NGO that we have to inform you that we're gonna suspend our operations due to lack of financing this year. So it's unpredictable, it's not reliable, And even when things weren't as moving in the world in terms of policy, particularly in the US, uh, maybe it was slightly more reliable, but there's a lot of effort to not intervene in a way that there is dependency forever. And so it's good to give humanitarian assistance. And my colleague from the social affairs, we're in a task force for the displaced and others. And one of the ideas we're always promoting. So there is a database that's trusted that was done with the help of a consultants from the international community. This is the database of recipients of help, but it's a static in the sense that it gets augmented a little bit, but it's the same people. So we can't keep helping the same people for 10, 20, 30 years. We have to do something to make sure that those we give handouts to today, we also help them have something, either a business or a skill, so that later they are independent. They don't have to depend on aid. I think I've abused on the time. Thank you.
So much, and you're raising so many important topics, including these different streams of aid from humanitarian to development, how they work or don't work together, these longstanding questions about local capacity versus international interventions. Jake, let me turn to you, co-founder and managing partner at Cross Boundary Group. You're working in some of the most difficult places in the world, including, I think, maybe still in Haiti, but definitely the Sahel, Goma, where we have violent conflict, ongoing war, sort of chronic instability. So, you're in these so-called humanitarian settings. I don't know if you would identify as a humanitarian per se. Tell us about the work that you do and the role of the private sector and the success that you've had working in some of these places.
Sure. You guys hear me? Thanks a lot, and thanks for this panel. So Cross Boundary, we're investment firm focused on bringing capital into underserved markets. We have a real specialty in blended finance and impact investing. And I would say, over the last 15 years or so that we've been in operation, periodically we get approached by foundations or other actors that have had a significant budget cut. And then they think, how can we make up through this through blended finance, through investment? And it is possible to make up some of it, but most of the activities, including those done generally in the humanitarian space, are public goods. And the ability to make it an investment proposition is limited. It's a powerful proposition and it can help, but it can't make up the whole shortfall. And so I just want to echo what I think Kate and others have said, which is this is a massive sun shortfall in the sector that cannot be made up no matter how creative we are with our blended finance approaches. When you think about sort of the typical annual spend of a foundation, it's the equivalent of like the substantial restructuring of a $1 trillion foundation. Like that's what's happening in the space right now. And so just, I'm excited about, and I do think there's some opportunities, but I also want to set the overall context that it's, a challenging frame that certainly cannot be made up overnight. And there are some real gaps. The other piece I wanted to hit on is just as a framing remark is the technical expertise point, because I think it's important to keep people motivated about this sector and to keep people motivated to join the U.S. civil service, various aspects of the U.S. government, of these organizations for careers. And what's happening, or has, I think, happened to some extent in the last couple of months, is there's been a conflation of debate about policy decisions or business decisions or spending decisions and the people implementing them. And my personal experience going back, I was a Marine 20 years ago, served in Iraq, and I actually think the US society really gets this right. Served in Iraq in a war that lots of people disagreed with. I certainly myself disagreed with lots of aspects of what was happening at the time. But when you came back, it was very much, thank you for your service. Can I buy you a drink? Can I take you to lunch? How can I help you? And that is not necessarily what I see happening right now with the return of a lot of career civil servants who have sacrificed a lot in the same way that myself and others did back in the day. And if we don't honor those sacrifices and decisions in a way that can be abstracted and separated from the policy debates, which are fine and people can have their opinions, that's going to be a real long-term weakness for us because we want people to be continued to be motivated for civil service to work towards public goods. So I just want to make those sort of two framing remarks. And then, yes, of course, change does bring opportunity.
I think all of us, see and have seen massive inefficiencies, massive opportunities for reform, and some of those things can, and we now have a catalyst to make them happen. And I think we can get into them, but I would, probably put them into a few different themes. One is just to be much more tightly coordinated in a bottom-up way, and be really thinking about, okay, what is the Venn diagram? What is the sweet spot in the intersection of what's in the interest, or what the the home country government, potential funding governments are willing to fund? What are the parts of it that are investable? And making sure those efforts are not sort of all happening in isolation, and that everyone is undertaking those things in a way that just sort of replicates these fixed costs over and over again. I would say the fundamental observation, and when we started Cross Boundary, was that even in the most dire of situations, Afghanistan, Iraq, DRC, even in the most violent areas within those countries, say Kandahar and Afghanistan, people still respond to economic incentives. Economic incentives are still present, which means businesses can still be present, which means cash as a modality and a way to operationalize and see how those incentives play out is still quite useful. And by being bottom up and using business and how people make choices who are closest to the problem, the people who are best placed actually to know their own needs and how they want to allocate to those needs, business and investment can be a powerful engine there. But again, that said, there are things where certainly the ability or willingness to pay for a good or service is not going to fully line up with the public good that service creates, and therefore you're going to need blended finance, or sometimes, in some cases, pure donor financing. So, I do see a lot of opportunities in this period, but I want to be realistic about the challenges as well.
Jake, Rania Al-Mashad, Egyptian Minister of Planning, Economic Development, and International Cooperation. You're an economist. You've worked on monetary policy for much of your career. You've had a lot to say about fragility and the space between humanitarian and development. Can you share a little bit of your perspective? And now, in light of what our colleagues are describing, these seismic changes, where do you see the role of multilateral development lending institutions, and where can they step up or step in or accelerate their engagement in some of these spaces?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this topic. It's not a very pleasant topic because there's a lot of human life attached to resources. And just I want to maybe underline a few facts. First, the diversity of the participants on this panel just reflects the multi-stakeholder, the approach of this issue. The second point, we are coming at a time when ODA is dwindling significantly. So all the development assistance to start with has been dropping. If you take a look at OECD numbers, it's actually quite less than before. So even the notion that we're going to be able to substitute one donor by another is not, there's not that space. The third point is the world today, in terms of finance, is even becoming more volatile and more uncertain. So what we were maybe hoping to do 3 weeks ago is not necessarily possible today, or it's going to be a more wait and see given the circumstances. So what do we do in this space? First, a realization that any humanitarian challenge in a country is also a developmental challenge, because if you're unable to get external finances, it has to come from the budget. Otherwise, you'll have so many homeless or sick or an impact on your own population, which is so it will have to come out of fiscal space, and that sometimes is not available. So it is, at the end of the day, a developmental question. The second point, when you take a look at the money that used to come to NGOs or to United Nations agencies to be able to mitigate humanitarian impact, there's a lot of operational cost. And we had a discussion last annual meetings that the overhead for many of these institutions, it's quite high. So the net that goes to the people most in need the math sometimes is a little bit appalling. So this is maybe an opportunity to try and think of how can we actually evaluate or put a number around the operational cost for the different agencies. The third point, and I like that it was mentioned from the different panelists from different experiences, the NGOs. In many instances, and I don't want to sound mean, but it's a source of sometimes, again, a stream of income for different institutions, or maybe partly that way. So, I mean, regulating NGOs is not something that we're advocating. Because again, they are the ones on the ground, they are the ones that are able to reach sometimes faster than governments, but there also has to be some sort of system to maybe judge the efficiency or the efficacy of different NGOs over time, because many of them show up in different countries at different crises and so forth. So what you mentioned in terms of the bottom-up coordination, I think that is key. A few other points, and in your introductory remarks, you mentioned the UN system, the calls for not holding back aid or humanitarian assistance in certain countries. It's becoming a very a tough situation when world order is not as clear or benchmark as it used to be a few years ago. So that adds an additional challenge as well. If you are asking for humanitarian assistance and it does arrive, how do you make it reach to where it's supposed to be? So there are some political impediments at times, even if the financing is availed. So, how do we collectively, who is the authority to call for this when the UN system has tried once and again, but in many instances has not had that political cloud, or if we're questioning multilateral systems altogether. You mentioned MDBs. MDBs are going through, I don't want to say a self-discovery, but this notion of the international financial architecture has been on the table for the past 3 years or so. How do we increase their capital? And this was happening at a time when the global economy was much better, if you will, than it is today. And there's a lot of reorientation on what their objective should be. Certain programs are being cut off, certain elements are being reprioritized. Humanitarian assistance is not always the first element on the agenda of the MDBs. It's sometimes linked to desertification. It's sometimes linked to vulnerable, for example, women who disproportionately get affected. And in the World Bank, for example, IDA, there has been some progress in terms of increasing the money for IDA in this last round. How much of it is humanitarian versus developmental is a question that we can, and if there's recommendations in a white paper, I think it would be very useful from this session and elsewhere to provide it to the World Bank, because the financing has been more or less secured or committed. We'll see about the disbursements, but I think it would be quite useful for fora such as this to provide very articulated policy recommendations so that they are taken on board very early on. It's a fact of life that humanitarian assistance is going to be on the rise. I don't think that when we look at the numbers of USAID, they seem to be very material in that space, and I don't see from other partners that they will be able to fill that gap as fast as needed. So I don't think we have much answers. There are more concerns, but maybe putting together a very honest framework where we are also self-critical. I think that might push us forward. Very interesting on the blended finance. But there's today a discussion on debt swaps. a lot of discussion on debt swaps and debt swaps with purpose, debt swaps related to, health or education. There might be with some of the philanthropic money that exists, a way to, and many of the countries that go through humanitarian issues are the ones that have high debt. So that might be also a way to have this intersection between debt, humanitarian assistance, and some of the innovative sources of financing. The World Bank is doing that these days. Many countries are doing bilateral debt as well. So again, I feel that ODI can, through these engagements, provide very articulate policy recommendations that can be pushed forward. So I just put debt swaps on the table because they have been mentioned in the Pact for the Future in the UN last September. We have the Financing for Development Conference coming up in Spain in June. So for the negotiators, there can be a section on humanitarian assistance so that financing for development does not overlook this very critical element, because again, if you have humanitarian issues in your country, it's very difficult to develop, whether they are displaced people because of migration or because of natural disasters or because of conflict and war. Thank you
so much, and I know you have to get to your next engagement, but appreciate the key points you're making about ensuring that we stop working in all of these silos and making sure that whatever we are able to do moving forward, particularly on the humanitarian side, that it is part and parcel of all of the conversations, negotiations that are happening across the development and other spaces. So thank you. But, on this question about localization, this is an ongoing discussion now for many, many decades. And Kate, I'll come back to you to start off on this. It's not a new issue, but perhaps there's a lot of urgency. Now, when we look at the financing situation, it is true that we're looking at a U.S. budget maybe moving from somewhere around 18 billion. It could go down to a couple billion. I think it's unclear exactly where it will land. We'll have to see where the U.S. Congress comes in. But it's possible that in the next couple of years, despite this dramatic drop, the United States remains a top humanitarian donor. So where do you see the localization agenda going if the resources remain concentrated, not just in sort of traditional donors in the global north, but in Washington in particular? What is the future for that agenda from your perspective?
Thanks for asking this, Elizabeth. And I just want to pick up on a couple of quick points before moving on to that, because I think they're relevant. We've been sitting here talking about, how much has disappeared in the last 3 months, largely due to the precipitous actions from the review of U.S. foreign assistance and some of the other aid cuts announced by other donors. But what I didn't mention is, as much as that is concerning, what concerns me even more or compounds that is that a number of these donors, chiefly the US, but also Keir Starmer said this when he announced the UK aid cuts, said, we'll continue to provide life-saving humanitarian aid. That's wonderful. I'm a humanitarian. My entire background really is in this. But I find that this is a very regressionist approach, right? It's been mentioned that the world is becoming more unstable, whether we're talking about climate change impacts, economic shocks like we experienced and are still recovering from, that wiped out a lot of development progress like COVID-19. And then obviously all of the conflict going on around the world. We're looking at a situation where the humanitarian bill will become higher and higher if we do not focus, and I'm not talking about spreading the butter super thinly across the development world, but really focus in fragile places where we actually can predict that these things are going to happen and get ahead of them. Because truly, in many ways, while humanitarian assistance represents the best of humanity, it also represents a failure of the ability to get ahead of crises, to stop the impact of those on civilians, to ignore data that shows where these vulnerabilities lie, and to adapt and invest money in ways that we know work. And so I'm very troubled, in addition to the aid cuts, by the fact that everyone is focusing in on life saving because they don't want to take that off the table. But it's not a very strategic approach. And I'm very concerned that we are going to see humanitarian needs explode around the world. And when we were already facing a situation where, for example, 75% of the acutely food secure around the world are in fragile states. 16 out of the 25 countries around the world that are predicted to have the highest impact of climate change are fragile states, yet they receive only 8% of the multilateral funding for climate adaptation. If we're looking at opportunities, or rather a strategic vision that guides us through this time and better use of resource, it should be about channeling these resources to places where they will stabilize things and prevent this, mass displacement, protracted emergencies, very predictable climate shocks, and enable people to weather them and not be receiving, as I think the minister from Haiti said, humanitarian funding year after year. That represents a failure, and we need to change course while also providing life-saving assistance when it's needed. Just quickly on your point, Elizabeth, on locally led, there has been, unfortunately, largely rhetorical progress towards this end, but some real progress, including under the last administration, sort of in the US, moving towards specific targets. Several other donor countries have moved towards targets for direct funding to local NGOs. I know a number of NGOs in the room here also take locally led approaches where it's not just about direct funding, but it's about true partnership. It's not a transactional relationship, but throughout the program cycle and in shifting power and leadership to local organizations in an effort of true partnership. And I really fear that what is going on right now is reversing course on all of that. I mentioned before that the aid cuts, due to their precipitous nature, had a huge impact mostly on local and national organizations. The implementing partners that have run these programs that have been terminated mid-course had to make very fast decisions, including not being able to continue their partnership with local organizations, which do not have the reserves or the financial ability to pivot, certainly not at that rate. And in fact, a lot of them have closed their doors. I'd use the example of a program we had terminated in Sudan, which was the definition of a life-saving program, where we were funding the emergency response rooms, which, for those of you who are not familiar, these are organizations that are sort of soup kitchen, local medical support, really on the front line in the hardest to reach areas of Sudan. And so because this funding was terminated, something like 1,400 of these are no longer receiving support and are having to close their doors, which has a huge impact on, obviously, people receiving that assistance who are on the threshold of famine, but also in terms of the ability and capacity of those groups to continue into the future. So I think that we need to look at one of the massive collateral damage of some of these aid cuts in the lens of what it is doing to local capacity in these local organizations, the trust that it's breaking. Even if these resources come back online or come back in a different form, there is irreparable damage done, and we need to really examine how to bring that back to life. And I'd close by saying, what a lot of people don't realize about direct funding for local and national NGOs, and something that the US government was starting to examine during the last administration, is just how onerous a lot of institutional donor processes are for partnering, right? A lot of the procurement regulations, all of the requirements, and they generally will take smaller amounts of resources just not to overwhelm their system. That takes a lot of hands-on support from bureaucrats, and it's a very worthy endeavor. And as has been mentioned multiple times here, we have lost so much in terms of technical capacity and procurement capacity with the loss of USAID. And what is going to happen, I fear, is that we are going to be concentrating resources into much larger agreements, whether for the UN or large NGOs, and actually moving away from the ability to provide this assistance directly to local and national organizations. So in order to partner with these groups, you actually need these really critical bureaucrats within these aid agencies. And they have, at least in the US case, been by and large wiped out. And that is another unfortunate impact of what has occurred over the last 3 months.
Minister Floresville, could I maybe turn to you? I mean, Kate talked about some of the impacts. Tell us what the impacts are going to be or are already in Haiti with programs sort of just stopping cold and a future where there could be considerably less reliability on external resources.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll do the same thing. Before going to it, I want to make a comment. Unfortunately, the minister from Egypt left, but if there are going to be minutes, I'd caution on how it's worded about IDA, because I lived in the boards of the World Bank and IMF for years, and what is clear is that in the minds of the bank particularly, and IDA, the development aid is not humanitarian aid. So it's not so much finding how much is humanitarian, how much is development, in my view. It's making sure that the message goes that it's costly not to engage in an FCS environment particularly. So to convince everyone, because there seems to be, from what I understand, a move towards saying, oh, engaging in FCV money, it's like wasted money and we shouldn't keep engaging, it's humanitarian, etc. So we have to be very cautious. If you don't engage today with countries in fragile situations, you're going to lose the investment you made in the past, and you're going to have to invest much more when you do start all over. So I wanted to make that point before I answer your question. In terms of the impact of cuts of humanitarian, I insinuated, like for the NGOs, a lot of NGOs are writing to us, and we know that some of them received money from the US, that they no longer have financing, they will stop their activities. But I want to put something in perspective. In Haiti, we basically living three, I think the term is yammies, three punches at the same time. Because we're not just worried about the humanitarian aid that's not coming. We also have to worry about the fact that a lot of people will be repatriated, which is putting already pressure. There are already some returnees from the Dominican Republic and from the US. The people who are going to return, there are two impacts. A lot of them have sold everything before they left. How much they'll be able to come back with, we don't know. But we know some of them will not be able to go to their hometown because circulation isn't that easy. But the most direct impact is, as many of you may know, the diaspora sends a lot of money back home. It's much more than what external assistance is. So hundreds of thousands of people returning who either came under humanitarian parole or temporary protected status who were in the US, and sending money that finance schooling all over the country, finance feeding of families, finance medical fees. That's adding to the humanitarian crisis. So that's the second shock, I would say, Yami. The third one is the non-renewal of the HOPE legislation that gave Haiti access to the US market for textile and tax-free. And there was a lot of lobbying done, and right now it's on hold. The last Congress didn't address the issue. There was a lot of pushing so that it was on the agenda so that it will be voted renewed. Already we lost a lot of industries, not only because of the crisis, because outside of Port-au-Prince, where there isn't all the security issue, industries needed to know at least half a year ahead, but normally a year ahead, that they're going to be able to function under the same laws. A lot of them have already packed. Besides the security, we lost from 60,000 employees. The last estimate I had was about 20,000 only or less. So if we don't have that, that's a whole source of income, source of employment that disappears also. So we have three armies at the same time. Now, directly in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of the US, what we do know, the first concern we had was for the health sector, because the US basically covered all throughout the country health centers. And we're already feeling that. There were some waivers being given, some medicine, for example, for AIDS patient. I'm not sure about tuberculosis, were stopped for a little while, and then I think there was a waiver, so they're still receiving some life-saving medicine. But our own health system was already below what's needed by the population. And with the destruction that happened, there is not even 1/4 left. And with the health centers outside Port-au-Prince, we really have a crisis. And if you follow Haitian news, you'll know that one of the biggest hospital, which was financed by, led by Zami La Santé, and in which the past president of the World Bank worked for 8 years, and in Mirbalais, was under attack recently. And before that, Doctors Without Frontiers, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Port-au-Prince had in many places to close shop. So our health system is in crisis. So what we are doing as a government is trying to replace those needs with treasury money, which is limited, responding to the displaced also with treasury money so far, but with limited capacity because the numbers are going up every day. In a health crisis, people who are living in camps, there are all kind of diseases that are resurfacing. Besides the low level of care, the other, I think, impact is on the youth, not only in healthcare, but also in education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to just quickly come back to Jake and to Jim, and then we're going to go to questions. But I mean, one of the questions I have for you, Jim, is you'll know from living and working in Washington that historically there was a fairly strong bipartisan consensus on the principles for which we were providing foreign assistance. So whether it was humanitarian principles, bringing refugees into the United States due to persecution, promotion of democracy and good governance. I mean, it just strikes me that with that breaking down, the future of any type of U.S. foreign assistance is difficult, or even the basis on which it may be provided is unclear. Can you offer some comments, and how do you see that piece of it moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what this proved is that the bipartisan consensus was either non-existent or it was really held together by 2 or 3 people. It clearly wasn't very deep. Because if it was very deep, I think the outcomes would have been different. I think what this tells me is that there does need to be a rethinking of assistance and sort of the way that the US government and Republicans and Democrats come together on this. So I think there is some opportunities to do some long thinking over the next, over the next year, saying over the next 5 or 10 years, what does a bipartisan consensus really look like? I mean, just to be honest, how many NGOs or development folks hired Trump political officials out of the first Trump administration? I know of one. So that's not a consensus, right? It's nice to say, oh, well, we had Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham liked us. Yeah, he did. Until he has a primary and he can't speak up because he's terrified of a primary. So I think it is important to have this conversation. I think it is important to look at what that bipartisan consensus really looks like. I think it is important to really challenge the modalities of approach that has long held on the development assistance. Is this consistent with conservative thinking and approaches? I think conservative and Republican legacies around foreign assistance, from PEPFAR to MCC to the DFC and Trump 1, I think are really great legacies. I think they were largely separate rather than integrated into the larger development sort of apparatus. So I think this is an important moment for us to get back to work and to really think about what are those principles, what broke down, why was it so shallow in terms of support inside the Republican Party. And what can we do moving forward to sort of rebuild trust around efficiency and effectiveness, and rebuild trust with the American people that we are running programs overseas to their own benefit. And I think if you see the disconnect, it's not just in the United States, there's a massive disconnect between government policies and populist support in Europe for development assistance programs as well. And I think we really need to rethink how we talk about this, but more importantly, what are the right approaches to really demonstrate that these programs are important to the health, safety, prosperity of that country that is providing the assistance, in addition to the country that's receiving the assistance.
Thanks. If I could perhaps offer one point of consensus, at least in the conversations I've had, it's that the private sector has to be a piece of this work going forward. And I think that is at least one foundational element. Now, we know, and as the minister explained, lots of different kinds of private sector actors out there, many of whom are extremely risk averse, or who can't foresee even operating in places that are the least bit sort of unstable or unpredictable. That's not the case for the work that you're doing. Jake, you mentioned, though, the criticality of the public sector, public support, public financing, working in concert with the work that the private sector can do in the most fragile places. We know that these resources have declined and will continue to decline. We have less of them, but it seems that they are essential to help entities like yours move forward. So what are sort of your recommendations for how that limited public sector financing can be used most effectively? And what are some of those examples where you've seen it work well?
Thanks, Elizabeth. And maybe just to briefly touch on Jim's point, because I think he's right that we clearly failed to make the case consistently enough or broadly enough. But I think there is a great case why all of these things are in the U.S. self-interest. I was having a month or so ago having drinks with a few old friends from the Marine Corps. I was a sniper platoon commander. They were both in force reconnaissance. These are not super touchy-feely guys. They're kicking down doors in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're doing counter-piracy missions in the middle of the night off the Horn of Africa. And they are concerned about what is happening in the development and humanitarian space. So I actually don't see anything inconsistent with what we're talking about in terms of the need for support and the needs for reforms and more efficient delivery and the agenda of a more prosperous, more secure, stronger America. I see these as completely consistent, and it's just a question of how and what's the most efficient and effective use of public resources when they're needed. I also, echoing the minister's point and others, I think the distinction between sort of humanitarian and development is artificial, just as the distinction between conflict and post-conflict is artificial. Investment is possible in all of these fragile situations, even in very fragile situations, and you can start working with that sort of investment long-term mindset of what are sustainable economic incentives all along the way. You don't have to wait for security and perfect rule of law and a new constitution. Like, all of these things can happen in parallel, and they should happen in parallel. And I think there is a real interest. I mean, when I go and speak at business schools, like the sessions, and it's not because of me, but the interest in impact investing in blended finance in finance and private sector as a tool for good, like all these sessions are way oversubscribed. So I think there's a lot of interest in applying this toolkit to tough places and to meaningful challenges. But there's really often a first mover disadvantage when you're trying to, as the private sector, to do something for the first time. And that is where public sector support or some grant support or concessional or catalytic financing that can help overcome that initial disadvantage can be quite vital in helping businesses that then become quite sustainable. And I could give dozens of case studies where a small amount of initial grant financing led to businesses that are now hundreds of millions in assets and not reliant on grants whatsoever. But it does require a mindset that's focused on the long term and what is sustainable over the long term and is realistic about what people can and can't pay for and what what sort of returns are expected, all of those things, and is realistic about what also needs to be a purely public good and should be funded, philanthropically, or by the public sector. Maybe just give a couple examples of where I do see sort of, some good potential, and I'm hopeful. One is the Africa Resilience Investment Accelerator. It's a program called ARIA. It's a program jointly funded by 3 DFIs, the British, the French, and the Dutch development banks. Development Finance Corporation down the street, IFC, have also been quite helpful players to ARIA as well. And the idea was, okay, for these fragile markets, and they picked 5 in Africa, where on a one-off basis, it didn't make sense for any one of them to set up local offices, or to, it would be too much for them to do independently. But together, by pooling their resources, they can have people on the ground for the long term. They can approach the pipeline of investment opportunities in a much more coordinated way. And so you see this coordination that we're talking about happening in 2 important ways. One is the coordination between the DFIs, but the other is a very tight coordination between the use of grant dollars, of technical assistance dollars, and the investment officers that actually can make investment decisions. And that's where you see these huge leverage effects, where a couple $100,000 of the right type of technical assistance or first loss can mobilize ultimately tens of millions of dollars in investment capital that is seeking a return and can be recycled in the future. And then the last aspect of how to think about the partnerships with the public sector, as Kate mentioned, is on the procurement side, and also a need for procurement reform. For investors, for the private sector, we cannot operate in like a cost plus type, huge amount of bureaucracy construct that much of the development space has operated in for a long time. We can operate in milestone-based grants, we can operate in firm fixed price, but if you take businesses and then try to make them operate as cost plus NGOs, it distorts a lot of incentives. And so I think there's just an opportunity to also simplify things on the procurement side and have tools that can be much more nimbly deployed, and are not sort of 2-year planning cycles for 5-year long programs, but can be responsive and opportunistic to where there is investment interest. Because I do think there is a lot of real investment interest, and we should be looking to accelerate the existing actors that are doing and want to do things, rather than feeling like we have to build from scratch.
Thank you so much. One comment, and then happy to take questions from those of you here in the room. And I take your point, Jim, about the depth of the bipartisan or the depth of the commitment to the work and how thin or thick it may have been. But one thing I want to say, and it's something I think you emphasized as well, I mean, my experience has been that when you deal with the American people across this country in every state, and just on an angle that I've been involved in on refugees, in the last administration, we worked on something called Welcome Corps, where individual Americans from any community in the country could volunteer to, bring and support and facilitate a refugee from anywhere in the world into their community. They did that out of an act of, compassion, support, generosity, a wide variety of other reasons. But what we saw in that program was it cut across class, it cut across ethnicity, background, urban, rural, red states, blue states. So I just highlight that as just one example, because I do believe that, and in the way that you describe some of your colleagues, there is a spirit that we all live on, inhabit this planet, and that we all have to contribute where we can to make things better. So I don't think it is a black and white issue, but it is something we clearly have to absolutely work on. And you want to,
I mean, I would just say that I think, to Jake's point, I think there is a path forward. I think the American people are the most generous the world has ever known. I think that's borne out both in the development assistance that's been provided over the past 50 years, in addition to the NGO direct giving that we have seen, especially over the last 30 years. So I think if you approach it the right way in terms of understanding the core benefit for both the work overseas and the benefit that it provides in the United States, and then link it to a private sector led approach, I think that can be really interesting. But I do think that we have to sort of break out of the way that we've historically thought about these things, as we start thinking about what comes next over the next 5 or 10 years. I think there is a path forward. And I think it's important for us to do it, right? I think that the death of foreign assistance aids China and Russia and diminishes the health, prosperity, and security of the American people. Like, and for us to start thinking about how do we rebuild this, I think it is important for us to understand both that the American people are generous, but I think there is a desire, and it's not just the American people. I mean, just look across all donor communities. There is not an outcry of anger around the UK's government decision to cut back. I mean, it's consistent across all of Europe and most of the donor community. There's just not this big opposition to cuts. And so I think everyone is struggling with this, and we do need to come up with a modality that demonstrates progress. And I think people are frustrated that they see that we continue to run the same programs in the same places for decades and are not seeing the same result, we're not seeing results. And I think people are demanding that we have progress. And I think there is an opportunity here, given the institutions we've built and the generosity that American people demonstrate.
Thanks, Jim. Let me turn to some questions. If anyone has a question here. Yes, please, Bill.
Thanks. This is for Jim because we share a common heritage in the House and at the State Department. You made a very good point about Congress when you talked about the potential reorganization of the department. I just wanted your take, and I do mean your take. It appears to me that when we canceled all these USAID contracts, they were appropriated funds, maybe not line item to a particular project, but say to the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. I haven't seen anything that indicates that the administration is going to propose rescinding those funds that had been appropriated. Are we headed toward an Article 1, Section 9 kind of conflict between Congress and the administration? Because I mean, your point about reorganization is well taken, but if we're just going to rescind funding, not rescind, that's not the right word. We're going to terminate contracts, not rescind the funds.
Yeah.
You know, what good's Congress in any of this?
Well, I mean, you're going to run into, you're either going to rescind or you're going to impound. I mean, those are the only two options that I can see, right? So those are the two. And this is, I've made this point a couple times, not necessarily here, but other places. I do think Congress does need to aggressively go towards a State Department authorization bill that clearly lays out markers for both either codifying portions of what what Secretary Rubio put forward yesterday. I think that's a fine template if this is the direction that the folks are wanting to go. But I do think congressional engagement is important on the authorization side. Hold hearings, start doing markups. I think that will provide a good release valve in terms of the pressure that Secretary Rubio has from the White House, sort of divert attention a little bit, and also provide some buy-in from Congress. Look, the appropriations is going to be really hard. I don't see a path forward. I mean, you're not going to get individual appropriations bills. You don't have the margins for that. It's too controversial. I don't even see how you get to an omnibus. Again, same challenge. So then you're going to end up with a CR, which is going to be the same funding level as the time before. Okay, got it. So you either are going to do rescissions or impoundment. And so I think the administration, my best guess is that the administration will take rescission first, get rejected, and then go towards impoundment, and then the courts will have a fight, and then we'll see what it comes out. But the reality is, you're going to have a CR, and then you're going to have a midterm election, and then, yeah.
Okay, for those of you who are not well steeped in the appropriations process, please see Jim and Bill after the
Sorry, I was an
it's okay.
appropriator for 10 years.
I get it.
And then,
Basically, we're talking about the money, the future of the money.
yeah.
And it seems unclear. That's the summary. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth and ODI, for holding this session. Thanks, panelists. Really interesting conversation. question for Jake. Oh, excuse me. I'm Tim Docking from the Refugee Investment Network. We've been pursuing these private sector strategies for about 7 years now, impact investing, blended finance strategies. And with regards to the future of foreign assistance, future of humanitarian assistance, I'm interested, Jake, where are you seeing, you mentioned a couple of interesting initiatives that you're observing now and have faith in, but more generally, vis-a-vis the private sector, where are you sensing demand? Are you, with some of your clients, hearing feedback from them in light of these, dramatic changes that you all have been talking about? And with regards to impact funds, family offices, these sorts of things, do they sense opportunity in this space, a gap that perhaps they can step into and not be pulled into, but where they want to get into? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, broadly, can you hear me okay? Well, one, maybe on the legislation point, I think one potential bright spot in legislation is the Development Finance Corporation, which does actually have great bipartisan support and is a great institution with a lot more potential and will likely be reauthorized this year. And I think that can be an important part of the story and a partner for impact investors, family offices, institutional capital that wants to do more in these markets. So I'm actually quite excited for the future of the DFC. I do think we are, on the purely sort of private sector side, we are seeing ever growing interest in impact investing from family offices, and particularly the next generation as they inherit wealth that is interested in the impact of their dollars and not just in parking their money with a money manager who they play golf with once a year. They want to be intentional and conscious about the use of their capital, and also think about it on the spectrum of, okay, it doesn't make sense for me to be doing something philanthropically over here that's not consistent with how I'm investing over here, and to think about the full spectrum of seeking a 20% IRR or 20% return to sort of giving away my money, and I might be open to do some things that are more catalytic in between. And so I think there's a lot of interest there. In terms of how is that actually playing out on the ground, we have about 25 offices, almost all of them in emerging markets, where we see a lot of opportunities. I would say one category is in tech and digitization and what it means for everyone, increasingly everyone to have a smartphone and the opportunity to provide services in a faster, more efficient way, to provide credit. And you're seeing that play out, with a lot of interest, even in this relative downturn, still consistent interest from venture capital and some good returns being made in these markets, which there's just also a pure investment opportunity there. There's an arbitrage opportunity there because not nearly enough capital is reaching, fintech startups in Africa, for instance, relative to the US. The other piece is in the infrastructure, and just thinking about the demographics and what is the infrastructure required to serve these needs, and to take again Africa, for example, 600 million people without electricity. Obviously, that is a massive investment opportunity that us and others are very active in. And it's going to be a mix of things like solar home systems, portable modular solar home systems. We've seen this in Haiti as well. Mini grids, extension of the main grid. All of these basic, human needs around energy and access now to data and bandwidth are both really exciting investment opportunities and really exciting impact opportunities. And we've seen with family offices that we partnered with, they're getting a return, but they're also getting the chance to go out and see the impact in the same way that they might have, previously for their philanthropic activity. So I do think it's a good opportunity.
Jake, I want to bring in my colleague, Freddie Carver, who is the Director of Program for the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global in London. And I want to begin just by asking you a question from one of our participants online, Julian Shope, who many of you may know. And he asks, while there is this consensus on a rethink, what will be the legitimacy of the new vision or consensus when it is reached with affected populations and governments? He says, they're left out to die now. Can the humanitarian endeavor and its professed values really overcome this betrayal and have a future?
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. And thanks to all the panel for, I think, a fantastic set of interventions so far. Okay, you asked a nice, easy question. I mean, I think this is a fundamental point I wanted to make as we kind of move towards wrapping up. I think what we've heard from the panel and it is the complexity of the question and the number of different kind of stakeholders that are potentially part of the answer. But I think really kind of fundamentally and inevitably to some degree missing from this conversation is the perspective of affected populations themselves. I come from Nairobi in the last week where we had a conversation with a wide range of stakeholders and based around a study that Ground Truth Solutions just put out, drawing on 30,000 conversations that they've had over the last 2 years with affected populations in different parts of the world. And I think the message from those conversations, the message from the discussion last week, as one person put it, somebody who grew up in Kakuma and is involved in this sector, things have been so bad for so long that actually people are going to struggle to engage with a narrative that says actually everything's about to fall apart. And we do need to engage with that reality. And we really need a process. I mean, to the core of this question around legitimacy, I think if the changes that are coming are going to have any legitimacy, they have to be built around the kind of perspectives of those people on the receiving end. I think, again, what we've heard really consistently across the interventions today is that things aren't working at local levels. We're still operating through a system that tends towards a default of a single blueprint approach towards humanitarian responses. And what we've heard, I think, is that this phrase localization is kind of much abused. And I think, Kate, you're exactly right, that there's been a lot of rhetoric around it without much actual kind of practical change. What it has to mean is a kind of really serious engagement with local contexts. And that isn't just a kind of replication of the sort of models that we have at local level. It's about saying, well, what's the role of government? What does the private sector look like? What's the role of remittances? And I really like the way I think that Jake put it, a kind of the questions we need to ask ourselves. First, what can government do? Second, what's investable? Third, what's left? Where do we kind of pick up those public goods? What's the role of the kind of sector? And that kind of thinking, it's just not sort of ingrained in the way the humanitarian system works today. So these are the kind of changes I think that we need to focus on. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ivers. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ivers Gerge. I am the Director of External Cooperation of AID. So I have two questions, one for Mrs. Forrester and the other one for Mrs. Phillips Barrasso. But first of all, thank you to the panelists for the interventions. My questions to Mrs. Forrester is, as you know, AID has been facing a lot of humanitarian crises, from earthquake in 2010 to hurricanes Sandy and Matthew, and also hurricanes and soft in 2021, and now with internal displaced person. So how can we break the cycle? How can we change the narratives? This is for Mrs. Forrester. And for Mrs. Phillips Barrasso, usually when we are facing humanitarian crises in some developing countries, you can see that sometimes the focus is on people, like their feelings. So how can we manage to keep the communication like fact-based and also complacent and sticking to the facts, but not really on people, like how they are feeling, this kind of thing. You see, like to have some privacy and the tragedy. Thank you.
Okay, I guess she wanted to remind me I should speak of some things. I think one of the lessons, and I think I tried to say that at the beginning, not only we need to be more prepared, but we need to help people be more prepared. And so that it's not always a humanitarian crisis. In more prepared in many ways, being self-sufficient, that's one. But also, I think we move slightly
in terms of disasters. We moved in the right direction. There's more preparedness, so much that the earthquake that happened in the South, I think it was 2016, 2021. We had an earthquake, big earthquake. We had many hurricanes. Then we had another earthquake that destroyed the South. And now we have the political crisis and the security crisis. What I can say is I think we are slightly more prepared for natural disasters so that we observe less death after natural disasters and others. And there's more preparedness and there's room already made in the budget for some kind of intervention without waiting for the outside world. There's the insurance system in the Caribbean that helps a lot. And as I took function last June, there is an initiative, the insurance from the Caribbean is CRIF that we subscribe to. They're the first ones who give us cash when there's a disaster. It's not sufficient, but it helps. And the second one, ironically enough, would have been the IMF. I say ironically enough because you don't think of the IMF as being the partner in disasters, but they have been. And when I took my function in June, I spoke to WFP, Le PAM, yeah, and they were offering to add something to our insurance, which would be automatic cash transfer to already designated people who are on a database so that the state wouldn't have to look for cash in its coffers. And even though there are some provisions, which is never sufficient, but they would automatically themselves do cash transfers, I think, on phones, on phone lines, etc. So I think it's readiness and what we are doing also. And I think somebody at the beginning said something that was really important that I should have repeated. It's challenges, but it's also opportunities. And it's opportunities if we grab them. It's to rethink how we live, rethink how we do international policies, how we arrange ourselves internally. And in rethinking, it's not to depend so much on imports, to promote our own agriculture, to consume locally, promote our industries. That will help us save money, save foreign exchange, as we don't export as much right now. That will also help us become more independent. And I know subsistence agriculture is not efficient and it's quote something of the past, but agriculture is very important. And we are a country that's in an island and we don't use sufficiently the water as a source of income. We're starting to, but not enough. So what we've learned all through the years is that people are not ready for shocks. We, the government, and with the help, we hope, of our partners, have to help people be more ready for shocks. But when a shock, I was going to say in French, dure, when a shock lasts more than a decade, I think even the most prepared is not, because right now the middle class is almost, they lose their houses, they lose their businesses, etc. The very rich are taking a hit, maybe they're still able to survive. But when a shock lasts so much, so long, there are very few people who can be prepared for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Kate, real quickly, and then I want to turn to Freddie to both wrap up and to proactively offer some recommendations that you and your team have been thinking about.
Sure. So I'll try to speak really, really quickly here. I just wanted to hit on a point that you raised in both of your questions, which is, opportunity here. I don't think that resources have been directed enough in their totality towards transformation, right? I heard that in some of the remarks made here today in terms of, do we have a common vision of what we're trying to do, particularly in fragile states, that we're directing all resources towards, whether they're from an individual donor like the US or through donor cooperation, right? So that we can see those breakthrough moments, particularly in fragile states and in situations like what we've heard today with Haiti. But if I understood understood your question correctly, I think that most of the major international NGOs have been trying to move away for a while from what you said, sort of focusing on the dignity of people who are affected by disasters, their agency, right, not victimhood, and actually have a lot of internal policies about the types of pictures that we're allowed to use, the types of stories that we use, although we know that appeals to the public during times of crisis, and humans really respond to crisis. We also believe that they respond towards hope and the ability that we can achieve something here. I think you heard that today in terms of where the American public is, that they're generous, but they're disaster fatigued as well in their dollars, right? And I think that's an important story to tell. Mercy Corps talks about it in ways of cope, adapt, thrive, not just cope, right? We want to help you cope if there's no other options, but we're most focused on helping you thrive and have this progress be sustainable and irreversible. And I think, again, as we're talking about the future of foreign assistance, it's not adding up to a total story that allows us to focus intensively enough on the adapt and thrive part and is over-indexing towards cope and this concept of people caught in cyclical humanitarian crises, where that's not a foregone conclusion if we make the right types of investments at scale.
Freddie, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I mean, it's been such a rich discussion. And I think I really appreciate not just the different perspectives we've had, but also some of the really practical suggestions that we've heard about the way forwards. I want to start by trying to kind of say something about, I think, the sort of nature of the moment we're in. And I think one of the big challenges is, and this goes back to something you said at the start, Kate, we've seen how resilient the humanitarian system is to change. I mean, the Grand Bargain was 10 years ago now. A lot of commitments were made. A lot of discussions have been had since then. And we haven't seen real fundamental change on a lot of the core commitments that were made then. So I think for those of us who see that there are some potential opportunities out of kind of where we are now, that change is coming. The question is what that change looks like. And I think the question for all of us is, how do we seize that? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard won. And we need to be really, really clear about what the core purpose is. I was thinking, Jim, about something that you said earlier, and I've tracked the kind of process of the merger in the UK over the last 10 years pretty closely. And I think you're right. There are potential advantages to doing this. But the key question is, do you have that clarity of purpose? Do you know what it is you're trying to achieve? Can you line people up behind that? Because if you don't, then you've got a big problem. And I think that also goes to this point that's kind of come up across the board, which is around the narratives and the stories we tell and the level of kind of support across different divides that we've generated. And I think one of the areas we've lost a bit of focus is around effectiveness. So we need to tell a different story about what effective humanitarian assistance looks like. We don't have time, I think, for some of the kind of the artificial constructs that we've built around the system. People have talked about the kind of divide, often artificial divide about humanitarian and development or about different sectors. I think we've heard some really thoughtful responses about what responses to readiness look like, about how the private sector can come in. But they require people in the sector to kind of move beyond the kind of the way that a lot of these things have been discussed and thought about, a lot of the barriers that have been erected to doing that over the years. And so I think we have a choice between either a sector that continues to kind of hold on to the ways of working that it's got used to over the years, as I think one person has put it, a kind of smaller, meaner humanitarian system, or we have a future where actually we can take on board some of these ideas. We can bring in some of the different perspectives that we need to make real change. And that has to come, as has been said, throughout from kind of local areas, from local voices. And yes, that includes civil society. And yes, that includes affected populations, but it has to involve government. It has to look at some of the issues you've raised around social protection, around how do we kind of get some of this work more on kind of government books, and then think about what's left. And I think this is another point that you made, Kate, we have the roadmaps. We have a lot of these ideas. We've been talking about them a long time. So let's make sure we kind of focus on that and focus on the reasons why those have been so hard to achieve. Do the easy things, and then we focus on the really hard problems, because there are really hard issues at the heart of all of this. And again, I think the speakers have done a really great job of raising those. So finally, just on the ODI global side, I mean, we are really keen to kind of try and support some of these conversations. We have already some kind of, I think, some important research work going on, particularly on the role of the state and kind of how the state has played a role in some key humanitarian responses in recent times and how we can learn from some of those processes about what needs to be done differently. I also highlight some work that's been done recently in our team around narratives around aid, looking at different parts of the system, looking at the response in Ukraine, looking at the role of cash, how different stories can be told and what kind of impact that has. Also some really critical work looking at livelihoods and resilience issues, protection and gender as well. I think what we're about to kind of do over the next year is really try and build a kind of clearinghouse for good ideas about where change can come from. I think we see there's a real need to do that independently of vested interests. Too much of the kind of barriers to change lies within the big institutions within the sector. They need to be part of the solution, but they also can't kind of control that solution too. So we're in the process of establishing a kind of body of expertise that can really help provide answers to different parts of the system. And we're keen to do that with, I think, all the different partners in this room and online, and to continue to help try and push this conversation forwards. So thank you once again to all the members of the panel.
Thank you. And Sarah Pontuliano, our Chief Executive, ODI Global, would you like to say anything?
I wasn't expecting to, but I only caught the end of the conversation because I was in another event downstairs. But Freddie very much summed up how I feel about this moment, and it's something I've been saying for a very, very long time. We've been dancing around the problems. We have brought a lot of technocratic discussions. I've said for a long time, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than building smaller, more agile, more resilient sea vessels. That's what the humanitarian system reform agenda has looked to me for 20 years. This is a moment of transformation, but it's up to us whether we seize it or not. And we've heard from so many of the people who are in the midst of humanitarian crisis, they don't recognize the effectiveness of this system. They don't recognize the system that we hold on so dear to as the response to the hardest moment of crisis. So it's time to take that on board and to really transform the way in which they are supported to respond to crises when they come. As I quote your reflections, Minister Forrestal, absolutely, government people need to be enabled to have that resilience built in. And it's only when everything at the local level is exhausted and there is no other way, then the support from outside needs to come in. So we need to totally turn that on its head. We've said it for too many years and not done it enough. Let's see if this moment of forced sort of rethinking, when it is so, in a way, traumatic perhaps for the humanitarian community, recognizing the difficulty of doing things in the way we are being pushed to do, but ultimately it's the right thing to do to finally transform the system in a way that puts the people in crisis at the center.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Very sincere and warm thanks to all of our panelists for your time and for your expertise. Thank you so much. And thanks for you, those of you who joined us.